Good morning, everyone. I am Kristen Neuschel. I am director of the Thompson Writing Program and a member of the history faculty here at Duke. I'd like to welcome you to the first of several events in the Campus Conversations series, Composing Knowledge in the Digital Age. This series was developed as part of the Thompson Writing Program's Digital Writing and Pedagogy Lab, which has been a year-long collaboration between the Thompson Writing Program and Duke Libraries. And this collaboration is exploring strategies for integrating digital writing and teaching in Writing 101, our signature course. The lab is led by Jennifer Ahern Dodson and Aria Chernick, Sarah Berghausen, is she here? And Denise Comer, Director of First Year Writing. It's funded by the Humanities Writ Large Emerging Networks Grant. With these conversations, we are embarking on a dialogue about the opportunities and the responsibilities for teaching writing and speaking and thinking to undergraduates in the digital age. After this morning's talk, we invite you to circulate and take in some of the events and poster presentations in the first year Critical Ink Conference, which is going on throughout the day. Now I'd like to introduce to you Aria Chernick, who is a lecturing fellow in the TWP, whose work focuses on digital pedagogy, multimodal composing, new media, and forms of knowledge. She is a TWP lecturing fellow. She's co-convener of the Digital Writing and Pedagogy Lab. She has a long set of titles because she's so busy and so crucial to the work we do. She's chair also of the Critical Ink Conference, and she is a Baca Foundation fellow. With a generous gift from the Baca Foundation, we have begun in the TWP work on LAMP. We go around saying the lamp is lit now. LAMP is the Language, Arts, and Media Program, and with it, it's a new initiative aimed at cultivating 21st century communication skills for all Duke students. Aria.
Hi. So I'm here to introduce Pete and Jesse, and it is a rare and special thing to work with someone who is an inspiring teacher, an incisive scholar, an idea architect with expansive vision, an eye for detail, and commitment of execution. Over the past year and a half, I've had the privilege of learning from and collaborating with not one of these people, but two. I first met Pete Rohrbaugh and Jesse Stommel the way so many academics share work, brainstorm teaching ideas, and generate scholarship today, on Twitter. Thank you. This last, that's how it sounded when I practiced it too. This time last year, I was teaching a digital humanities class and tweeted out to my students that I would be discussing an article co-written by Pete and Jesse and published in Hybrid Pedagogy. The article was about mass collaboration as a teaching model and giving action to their argument. Within a few minutes, Pete and Jesse had tweeted me back saying they would love to join my class. The next day, via Google Hang, Pete, Jesse, and I, as well as our collective students, talked about how participatory pedagogy and mass collaboration can help students form new methods of analysis, make their work personally relevant, reach a wide and genuine audience, and disrupt the role of the instructor to allow students to take ownership of their own learning. Our class discussion, which took place in a hybrid environment of face-to-face and online learning and involved participants in Oregon, Georgia, and North Carolina, was a poignant example of the best of critical digital pedagogy. Technology enabled the collaborative discussion. The open access digital journal Hybrid Pedagogy provided the intellectual content initially. But the new knowledge we created together was the star. Teaching and learning was not marginalized by technology. It was transformed by it. Pete and Jesse possess a striking commitment to reconstituting entrenched paradigms for our digital age regarding how and where teaching and learning happens, the resonance between joy and intellectual rigor, what knowledge is and who should have access to it, and how we can compose and communicate this knowledge in an engaged and participatory way. What has struck me most, though, from my early interactions with Pete and Jessie, through our myriad conversations and projects since, has been how they embody what may be the great hope for a new model of education made possible by technology, but fueled by the very human quality of generosity. So it is my great pleasure to introduce Pete Rohrbaugh, Assistant Professor of English in the English Technical Communication and Media Arts Department at Southern Polytechnic State University, the co-founder of Hybrid Pedagogy, and the organizer of the Atlanta Digital Humanities Digital Pedagogy Network for faculty and students, and Jessie Stommel, Assistant Professor of Digital Humanities at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, the co-founder and the director of Hybrid Pedagogy, and the host of Mook Mook, Dark Underbelly, a rambunctious Twitter discussion series rising out of Kathy Davidson History and Future of Higher Education MOOC. Welcome.
So we're going to actually flip the script a little bit and start with an activity. And so what I want you to do is I want you to either, if you're on Twitter, it's going to happen on Twitter. And the back channel for this conversation is on DigPed Makers, hashtag DigPed Makers. And you'll already see a flurry of tweets there. For example, our slides from today have already been tweeted. The link to the live cast that people watching us speak from the web right now. And you'll be able to go after this and check out the live cast, which will be archived. And so what I want you to do is I want you to either tweet, or if you're not on Twitter, you can write on an analog piece of paper, which we have a model here for that activity. She may be speaking later about this archaic technology that I'm not sure what that's called. Paper? Paper. Parchment. So what I want you to do is I do an activity with my students in my writing courses that's called the Twitter essay. And essentially what we do is we talk about what the nature of an essay is and what the qualities and the aspects of a good essay are. I have them brainstorm together these qualities. And then I have them write an essay in 140 characters that has all of the qualities that we've just discussed of an essay. You don't have to write a masterful Twitter essay today, but you can sure try. What I want you to do is with the person next to you, so in groups of 2, I want you to co-author a single Twitter essay in 140 characters answering the following question. If you're actually going to tweet this out, you'll lose some of your 140 characters because you'll need to add hashtag DigPed Makers somewhere within your tweet. If you're not tweeting it out, you can drop off the hashtag if you want, and then you get the entire 140 characters for your essay. The question that I want you to answer the question, what is scholarship? So 140 characters, I'm going to give you about 3 to 5 minutes at most to write a 140 character Twitter essay answering the question, what is scholarship? And then tweet it out if you're able. We'll be coming around if you have questions, and then we're going to share some of these with the group in addition to tweeting them out to the web. Good job. Okay, so then what we have to do, this is muted. We have to unmute it. We don't have to use this for ourselves. We have to unmute it, and then if we ask someone to speak, we have to go run it over to them. I can mostly do that, but if I might need you to do it if I'm talking, so I'll hand it to you to do.
The hashtag, I didn't quite get it then. Page makers? Or?
Take the E out and turn it into ped, like pedagogy, instead of page. So D-I-G-P-E-D makers.
Pedagogy. Oh, sure, it's still small. I'm kind of new to
That's good.
But,
We're
so
all
I think this is fun to try.
Yep, that's good. That works. So that means that when you write your tweet, you just make sure that that hashtag ends up somewhere in your tweet. It can be the beginning or the end or in the middle, doesn't matter.
With some space.
Yeah, space on either side. And then when everybody searches that tag, your tweet will come up with everybody else's.
And the spaces count as well as the characters.
Every button.
That's right, yes.
Every button. But it will, Twitter will actually, once you start writing a tweet, it will count. You see that
The
number
hashtag is up on the
126?
board
It
in
will
case
count
you're
down
not
there,
sure what it
just
is.
so you know. Hey Denise, how are you doing?
Good.
I don't want to knock over your coffee.
That's okay.
No, hey, it's nice to meet you.
So, I put a bear, is that right?
Oh,
And
you're
1 foot on the
talking-
parchment.
Or you kind of try write your tweet, right that, click that button right there. And then it will count down how many characters you have left. There you go. And then you just need to make sure that that hashtag is somewhere. And it can be in the front or the back, it doesn't matter.
This is more customary. Doesn't matter at all.
Doesn't matter at all. It's basically just code that says this belongs to a bunch of other stuff. So you guys didn't have to, you guys didn't even run out of characters.
No, we're done. We're
Awesome.
She's
Awesome.
a scientist.
There you go. Yeah, efficient.
Get it done.
That's good. That's good. Hey guys, does it make sense what we're asking everybody to do? Okay, cool. Done. You're already solved. You've already solved right away. Okay, good. Do you want to pull up the examples of that? We have we need to keep an eye on time.
Wrap them up in just a second. And I'll just take 2 volunteers.
We did ours in only 63. We have 63 characters left, and that's including the hashtag.
Wow. Yeah, Denise also was in the 60s. Her tweet was. I thought that it would be harder to do that, but
Not, you're a douche.
yeah, right. Efficiency. Yeah.
This requires a conversation. I think we'll just ask people to share a couple of theirs and we'll.
Do you want me to find somebody who didn't post it to Twitter so that we can represent one of those so they can read it?
I'll just ask them.
Okay.
Okay, you have exactly 30 more seconds for your 140 character Twitter essay. You can see some of them already starting to appear. Okay, let's get a couple volunteers to share their tweets, to read them aloud. There's a few that we can see already appearing on the board behind us, but do I have a volunteer? I have to bring you the microphone before you share it. Does someone want to share their tweet? Dun, dun, dun.
Lindsay Smith and I, the egg up there is scholarship is getting ideas out there for others to interact with.
Let's get. Let's get a couple more. Hold on.
Like friendship, companionship, or any other kind of relationship, scholarship is also a journey which people embark on, learning together and inspiring each other.
Nice. More volunteers?
So Jennifer Ahern Dodson and I wrote, "Scholarship is embracing and disrupting knowledge."
We'll come back to this discussion towards the end of our talk. We're just going to use that as a segue, some of your words as a segue into what we're here to talk about. This has to wake up. So I'm going to start by talking just a little bit about critical pedagogy, and then Pete's going to follow in with some of a little mini manifesto that we wrote about critical pedagogy literally last night. And one of the things that we're going to point out is that critical pedagogy is emergent. It's constantly evolving. And so I think Pete and I have presented about critical pedagogy many times, and every time we do it, what we have to say about critical pedagogy is slightly different, partly because critical pedagogy is never static. It's constantly renewing itself. I'm going to talk just a little bit about, just linguistically, when we think about the word critical in the phrase critical pedagogy, what work is that word critical doing? And so I have a few different ways that we can read this phrase, critical pedagogy, and I'm just going to walk through these relatively briefly, and hopefully this will get inflected through the rest of what we talk about today. Our goal is to present to you the ideas of critical pedagogy, but to move relatively quickly away from critical pedagogy. Critical pedagogy, in a lot of ways, is the base for the work that we do. The critical in critical pedagogy functions in several registers. Critical as in mission critical, essential. Critical as in literary criticism and critique, providing definition and interpretation. So thinking critically about pedagogy. Critical as in reflective and a nuanced approach to a thing. Constantly reflective, constantly recursive, constantly reimagining itself. Critical as in criticizing institutional or corporate impediments to learning. We talk quite a bit about the fact that critical pedagogy is not neutral, and Pete will be talking about that a little bit more in a second. And finally, critical pedagogy with a capital C and a capital P as the disciplinary approach which inflects and is inflected by each of these other meetings. So when we're talking about critical pedagogy, we're both talking about the discipline of critical pedagogy and some of the large influences on that discipline, Henry Giroux, Bell Hooks, Paulo Freire, but we're also thinking about critical pedagogy more broadly writ.
So moving off of those kind of theoretical explanations, what I want to talk about very quickly are ways that we see this, this discipline kind of moving into digital space. Because the joining together of a critical pedagogical approach and digital pedagogy is not immediately clear. And so for us, and especially for myself, I've had to kind of constantly come back to why would I use, or why would we concentrate on using a bunch of digital tools if we don't have kind of a clear foundation of why we're doing that? So it's essential for us to say at the beginning that to take a critical pedagogical approach is not neutral. It's not ideologically neutral. It's not politically neutral. And I think that kind of always calls our attention to the fact that when we are in a classroom and we're focusing on the circumstances, the material conditions, the historical context of that classroom, before we fill it with content, we're taking a kind of stance, a stance that's not flat, a stance that's dynamic. Also, this has been a really important kind of concept for us to kick around in the last couple of years. Critical pedagogy is emergent, which means that whatever we're doing in a classroom, especially if it's digitally inflected, has to emerge from that group, which is why we kind of have to rethink what we're doing if we can imagine having an entire class plan at the beginning of a semester and watching that class plan just completely unfold without any deviation. To be emergent means that we're responsive to things that happen in class while the semester or the course unfolds. It interrogates power, which is kind of like the central Freirean definition of critical pedagogy, that we are looking at the institution that conveys learning or wants to convey learning, and we bring an understanding of that institution into the classroom, and we're ready to interrogate it if we have to. And finally, and this is another kind of central Freirean concept, is that we think very deeply about what we're doing, and we're putting that into practice, and so that's the praxis piece.
And I'm going to extrapolate a little bit more on that before we move to the next slides. But for me, this is really important. And Pete and I actually had a debate last night. This is what happens every time that we give a presentation together. We have a rousing debate at 2 in the morning that completely rips apart everything that we were going to talk about the following day. Our debate was really about this question. It was about the question about this notion of critical pedagogy as praxis. And my position on critical pedagogy as praxis is essentially that all pedagogy is necessarily praxis. I actually argued to Pete that there's no such thing as bad pedagogy. At the point that it's bad pedagogy, it's no longer pedagogical. Pedagogy must be reflective, it must be active, it must be constantly rethinking itself. Otherwise, it's not pedagogy. And so my argument was that essentially you're not talking about bad pedagogy, you're actually just talking about bad teaching at that point. The point that you're really doing pedagogical work, it is necessarily good pedagogy. Even if it's not pedagogy that I agree with, even if it's a different kind of pedagogy, at the point that it's reflective, at the point that it is really living at this intersection of philosophy and practice, it becomes pedagogy. Something else I'll add about this notion of critical pedagogy, when you add critical pedagogy, it also means to me that this intersection of philosophy and practice isn't just happening for the teacher. For me, in order for it to be critical pedagogy, it also has to be happening for the students. So when you talk about disrupting hierarchies, there's a lot of different hierarchies that we're talking about disrupting, but for me, one of the central hierarchies is disrupting the distinction between the student and the teacher. A really solid, robust, interactive, reflective, critical pedagogy necessarily brings students into the conversation about philosophy and practice. At both levels. It both has students doing meta-reflection about what's happening in the class, students doing meta-reflections about the choices that I'm making as a teacher and the choices that they're making as students, and also at the level of practice. Students engaging in not playing out a static syllabus as though it's a script, but actually having an active role in shaping that syllabus as the term evolves. Whether that means literally remixing, forking, obliterating, reimagining that syllabus in a quite literal way, or doing it more sort of on the ground in the classroom. So I'm just going to read this brief quote as an introduction to Pete's next piece. Everybody is an intellectual in that we all have the capacity to think, produce ideas, be self-critical. This demands a new kind of literacy and critical understanding with respect to the emergence of the new media and electronic technologies, and the new and powerful role they play as instruments of public pedagogy.
Where I want to go from there is to kind of segue into this concept that that I've been playing with for about 2 or 3 years now, and I understand it's not. People have played with this term organic writing for a while now, so I'm not claiming that as only my term. But for me, when we started hybrid pedagogy, I wanted to kind of write an article that really investigated how it is that we get students to write and how we imagine writing as an act or composing as an act that moves us away from the anxiety that so many students come to the classroom kind of built in. And the way that I've always done that as a teacher from before I was really involving technology, from when I was teaching high school classes, before I came into higher ed, I was always asking students to write from the guts of the essay out to the edges. So to not start with
a thesis, to not start with the blinking cursor that's sitting underneath the title that you've already given for the piece that doesn't exist yet. And so this idea of organic writing, for me, has always been about kind of this organic metaphor of that you begin with a seed and you move to an organ, and you then kind of talk about structure and skeletons, and then you move to the skin, and the skin being the whole mechanical, technical, grammatical stuff that students kind of come in thinking that's what writing is. So this is a link to an article where I first kind of started playing with that idea. But in the last couple of years, and I'm going to talk about this right at the end, I've been very influenced by connectivist learning theory that's kind of evolved from the connectivist MOOC movement since 2008, 2009. And I want to talk briefly about a couple of ways that this organic process, which begins with one piece of writing, kind of can infect and take hold of a whole kind of group of classroom practices. And this is the first one I'll talk about, author cycles. So, and this is something that Jennifer was talking about earlier today. So this semester, for example, we read in our class Dave Eggers' new novel, The Circle, which is about, it's basically like 1984 plus Google. And when we finished The Circle, I asked students to pick a particular part of the novel that bothered them, because there's lots of things to be bothered about, and to write an exactly 100-word response to a prompt. They couldn't be one word less or more than 100 words. What we did then in class was we showed up on a Google document, everybody dumped their 100-word pieces, and then I divided the class up into these roles, these jobs up here at the top. And inside the Google document, people just started picking their job. I want to be the person that talks about how to license this essay when it's done under Creative Commons. I want to be the person that adds examples or quotes from the novel. I want to be the person that goes through and proofreads this piece when we're finished. And so from small little 100-word sections, we get this massive, piece of text that students then begin to start stitching together and looking for commonalities and deleting things that are redundant. And what I'm doing when I do this kind of an assignment is I'm trying to break the role of the composer into a bunch of segmented pieces and get them to focus on one piece, which they can do realistically in an hour after they've just come in with 100 words. And then at the end, they're able to step away from it and see, aha, this is what happens in our brains when we compose. When we sit down and take 2 or 3 or 4 hours to write a 1,000-word article, it wasn't that hard to bring 100 words to this discussion. It wasn't that hard to go back through everybody's text and find quotes from the novel that prove this thing that somebody else was saying. And so when they're finished, they've gone through all of these author jobs in kind of cycles, and they have this new piece to talk about that all of them have kind of left a fingerprint on. This is a huge, exploding, frightening thing, but I want to talk through it. This is an example of something I've been doing in class for a couple of years as well. And maybe one of the lines is cut off over there. But essentially, when I started moving to a kind of strong focus on multimodal composition, what I did was basically I broke the class up into 4 assignments, junking the typical kind of 4 essay model, and students had to compose a blog cycle, a multimedia presentation, a collaborative bibliography, and a presentation. And that wasn't enough for me because I wanted to really kind of shake up the process. So I said, you can compose, or you can choose the due date of these 4 assignments at your discretion. You can look at your semester, you can decide what order you want to do these assignments. But there's a due date throughout the semester, and you decide how you're going to move through these assignments, which kind of was terrifying in the sense that we're doing all of the assignments all the time. And the traditional way to view that was, well, that's frightening because you've got to teach how to do all 4 of those assignments in the first 3 weeks of class because somebody's got to do all 4 of them. But when we're able to share the work of everybody else in a format like this, then we can talk about how as we go through the semester and we get to the third kind of due date, that somebody who's working on a multimedia presentation, who's maybe never done that before, has already 2 cycles worth of students that have come through that assignment, have played with it, and composed it already. And so everyone's kind of moving through these things differently, composing things at different times, but we're always talking when we get to the end about what is that first thing doing? And what things would I change about the blog cycle that I wrote or the presentation that I gave in the first month of the class, considering that I've been able to see all of these things evolve? How am I able to go back if I'm writing the blogging cycle here at the end? How am I able to go back and trace what we as a group learned from due date 1 and due date 2 and due date 3? Hopefully it will move.
You just push the button on the keyboard, will it work?
There we go. This is another brief example of something that I brought into my class this semester. Let's go back one. So this semester, instead of working with these kind of larger compositions that I just talked about, I decided that I wanted students making really small, low-stakes, multimodal texts from the beginning of the semester, and I called them Engage, Reflect, Curate, and Collaborate. And on this assignment sheet, which goes another page and a half, I'm describing to students, this is what an Engage assignment or an activity does. This is what a Reflect activity does. This is what a Collaborate activity does. And they're small pieces. Students can complete these in, once they've been playing around with this for a while, they can complete these in half an hour, really, to an hour. But they model a kind of digital literacy focus that I want to see students develop as they get through, so that by the time we get to halfway through the semester, they have practiced the act of digital engagement, which means they've gotten on Twitter, they've found someone who's written an article or a story or a journal article that we've read, and they've interacted with that person. Or they've composed a Twitter conversation of people in class and moved a discussion forward on a text that we had. That's a skill that doesn't immediately, it's not inherent. If you're new to Twitter, engagement is very strange, because it's just this open space, and who's listening, and why would anyone care about what I'm putting out there? So I want them to practice that. And after we've gone through several weeks of students picking 2 of these activities and submitting them, publishing them every week, then we have this huge kind of collection of artifacts that then I ask students to go back into, choose one that somebody else has composed, and make that the focus of a larger multimodal article project that they're going to do. So that they're always kind of taking each other's ideas, repurposing them, remediating them, pushing more research on them, and coming out with a different text. And then the last kind of cycle I want to talk about is a conversation cycle. So I've constantly been wanting to get out of the discussion forum
Drudgery is the word you're looking for. Drudgery.
Yeah, the discussion forum discipline, the discipline of discussion forums. And so this semester I tried something new with Google+, which has a feature where you can build a community, which is essentially like a Facebook group. And students added into the Google community. And I just started populating it with stuff to read. The links to the blog posts that had all the assignments and activities that we were doing. And here at the end of the semester, I've been able to put together 4 prompts coming out of a story that we've just recently read, which has kind of blown my mind. This story called The Truth of Fact, The Truth of Feeling. Does anybody know this story? It's like the most amazing thing I've read in the last year. But as I put these prompts up, students go through, they look on Google+, they look at all the different prompts, and they just choose, this is the prompt that's interesting to me, and they start answering. And what this does, even though I'm giving some kind of prescriptive language up here, yes, you have to have 50 to 75 words. Yes, you have to be referencing somebody else's statement before you and attempting to quote from the story. Because this platform, for many of my students, is also sitting on their phone, and because whenever they interact with it or somebody is talking back to them, they're getting alerts, these discussion threads end up becoming significantly more dynamic. So that you find in the beginning you have these long, chunky kind of discussion forum-like posts. And further down in the chain, you see people referencing each other, dragging people into conversations, disagreeing with things. And then I've even seen cross-pollination between these prompts happening on Google+, which means that students are going to prompts that they're not involved in to watch what's happening so that they can kind of reflect it back on what they're doing here. So these are just a couple of examples of kind of really nuts and bolts examples of the theoretical stuff that we talked about in the beginning, and how these, for me, these practices push agency back on the student, and they disrupt a traditional kind of hierarchy that I think students are used to and that we constantly need to be divesting ourselves of. And then before we move on to Jesse's component, it's important for me to kind of come back to, I got it, the idea that, that in addition to critical pedagogy, which for me has been kind of a foundation for my whole entrance into the profession, these two concepts, connectivist composition or connectivism as a learning theory and rhizomatic learning, coming out of the work of George Siemens and Stephen Downes and Dave Cormier and Bonnie Stewart, they've had a huge impact on how I teach face-to-face classes and hybrid classes. But these are concepts that were built for online environments. So it's useful for me to kind of take the engagement that really good digital experiences have and kind of push it back into the face-to-face setting so that the class becomes dynamic, more dynamic.
I think it's interesting that we think about, when we think about critical digital pedagogy, I think that we want to think about the ways that our best critical pedagogies can influence what we do in digital space, but also think about the way that our digital pedagogies can influence what we do in face-to-face classrooms. And I think that, to me, is what hybrid pedagogy is about. It's about thinking about the way that we engage in space and how that engagement has changed and how it continues to change. So it isn't just that the internet completely changed how we interact in a classroom, or that the internet completely changed how we learn or how we write. It's that every new development influences and is part of an evolution, a continuing evolution of how learning happens, how writing happens, how scholarship happens. I'm going to talk a little bit about Hybrid Pedagogy, the journal, seeing if I can extrapolate some of what Pete talked about in terms of his face-to-face classroom and talk a little bit about that, how that's connected to the work that we do on journals. Something that I think is really important is that we stop thinking about our scholarship and our research as separate and distinct from our teaching. For me, hybrid pedagogy is pedagogical. It is teaching. It is part of my teaching. Honestly, when I go to fill out my tenure file, I will likely be required to have sections that talk about teaching and research and service. However, hybrid pedagogy will appear in every single one of those categories, because for me, it's an important act of teaching, an important act of service to the scholarly community, and also part of my scholarship and part of my research. And when I think about hybrid pedagogy being part of my scholarship, it's not just the act of writing for hybrid pedagogy or the act of conceiving of the journal or the act of designing it as a digital project. Also, the role of editing becomes a sort of scholarship. If we think about scholarship as collaborative, which is something that came up in a bunch of the examples that all of you tweeted and mentioned, then the role of editor becomes a scholarly role if you're opening yourself up to collaboration, to really collaborating, not just gatekeeping, not just reviewing, but feeling as though you're a real collaborator with the writers. And that's something that we've worked from the beginning with hybrid pedagogy to do, to talk about the ways that we actually call our process collaborative peer review, to draw attention to this, that it isn't just about gatekeeping, but it's actually about working directly with writers to help foster their writing. For me, I think about it also as a sort of advocacy. Being an editor is a sort of advocacy, and this is what I also think of my role as teacher. I'm just going to talk a little bit. This is right from the About Us page on hybrid pedagogy. And it's something that has continued to evolve. I keep tweaking tiny words in this. And Pete and I co-authored this 2 years ago, I think, but I continue to change words here and there. And the first bullet here is actually one that I just added recently. It had always been something that I said, but I decided that I wanted the journal to wear this right at the front, right at the top of its proclamation of what it is. The journal is not ideologically neutral. We imagine that our scholarship can be objective. In my mind, nothing that I write is ever objective. We can imagine that the role of peer reviewer can somehow be objective. I want to call attention to that here and say that editing, reviewing, even gatekeeping is never objective. It's always subjective. It always has ideologies. It always has politics. Some of the other pieces here, the other reason I wanted to start hybrid pedagogy was I saw conversations happening in all kinds of different rooms. There was a conversation about online learning happening in one room, conversation about MOOC conversation hadn't really started in mass at that point, but it was still happening since 2008, really. Conversation about MOOCs in another room, a conversation among students in another room, a conversation among K through 12 teachers in another room, conversation among instructional designers in yet another room. And I basically said, why aren't we all in the same room having these conversations about the nature of learning and writing? And so it was really about bringing those folks together. So that's the second 2 bits here. The next one is that it considers our personal and professional hybridity. I really wanted to create a space where our personal engagement with our work was right out in the open. So we're not just writing from a space of objective scholarship. One thing that the current managing editor, or the current editor, Sean Michael Morris, talks about is he talks about one of the first questions he'll ask a writer when they submit something is, how do you feel about this work? How do you feel about your scholarship? Where are you in this work? Because often we get stuff where it almost feels like the person who's doing the scholarship, the person that's doing the teaching, that's thinking about the pedagogy has been almost scrubbed from their work. And one of our first steps is to say, no, we actually need to bring our full selves to our scholarship. We need to bring our full selves to this work that we're doing. And maybe encourage students also to bring their full selves to the work that they do in our classrooms. Disrupts distinctions between students, teachers, and learners, something I already talked about, so I'll sort of move past that one. I'll talk about that a bit more. Also explores the relationship between pedagogy and scholarship, invites its audience to participate. This one's important. Invites its audience to participate in and be an integral part of the peer review process. So we talk about, essentially we have 2 levels of our peer review. We have the collaborative peer review that happens openly between editors and author. And then we also have the continuation of that process that happens between readers and author on the space of the journal. And it has always been our real goal to build community, to not have the stuff we publish be repositories for ideas, but to have them be starts to conversations. And thus interrogates and makes transparent academic publishing practices. This, for me, is how this work is my scholarship. I am creating processing, modeling processes with the hopes that this would influence the shape and the continuing shape of not just scholarly writing, but also academic writing more broadly. So what I've got here is I've got quotes, little snippets from articles, and I want to talk about the evolution of this project. One thing that we did early on in the journal is we talked a lot at a meta level about the journal in its formation. And there was a certain point at which Pete and I said to each other in the first 6 months of this journal, why is everything that we're writing and publishing about the journal? Partly in those first 6 months, it was about the journal because we launched the journal and we wanted the journal to evolve right in front of its audience. And that meant that the journal had no name, the journal had no institutional affiliation, so we didn't have any submissions. So essentially, we wrote all of the articles for those first 6 months, which interestingly, a lot of people thought, well, isn't this a blog? And no, what we thought about it is, we thought editors, they write an introduction to a volume or they write an introduction to an issue of a journal. That's what we were doing, but there was a way in which we were doing that right out in the open from the beginning, talking about the journal as it was in formation. And this is from an early piece that Pete wrote, really talking about how our work was founded in critical pedagogy. This next one here, so one thing that's happened on this journal is that while it doesn't have composition as one of its composition isn't right in its mission statement, in its sort of manifesto who we are, but it really underlies who we are because all of the editorial board for this journal are all composition teachers or have been composition teachers at one point or another. And that's changing as we open up more and more. And while our topic hasn't always been composition, we've talked quite a bit from the beginning about if you're a composition teacher, how do you run a journal differently? How do you bring yourself as composition teacher into the running of a journal? It becomes a different kind of relationship that you have with your writers. We have relationships with our writers that are much more like the relationships that we might have with students. Advocates, roles of advocacy, roles of helping them develop as scholars and thinkers. A few that I'm going to move through. This article talks a lot about our collaborative peer review process, and this is written by our current editor. He writes to listen for voices. The role of the journal is to listen for voices that have something to say, but which may not find purchase in traditional academic venues. Something we've wanted to do from the beginning was create a space for marginalized voices. And that's part of the reason why what we do is not about gatekeeping. What we actually want to do is foster voices that might not otherwise be heard. And essentially someone submits something, and if it's right for the journal, we're going to work with them until it's ready to be published. And that essentially means a lot of work for us as editors, but as long as they're committed to the process, we don't tout our low acceptance rate. And that's something I really want to maintain throughout the future of the journal, that ultimately we want a high acceptance rate, which is sort of turning scholarship on its head, because normally you talk about a low acceptance rate as being, woohoo, we're a great journal. We only accept 2% of the things submitted. I mean, ultimately, I would love it if we could accept 100%. We can't actually accept 100%. But sort of my goal is to accept as many as we can and get as many as we can ready for publication.
It's also worth saying, or worth reflecting on that responsiveness to the community, that in the beginning we did not start the journal with a focus on academic contingency, labor contingency, but the amount of people that were contributing articles and kind of like joining the community that the journal was kind of starting, they were very concerned about that. And we professionally were, but we weren't kind of front-loading that into the journal. That's become kind of almost the third rail of hybrid pedagogy, at least in the last year, are people writing stories about the adjunct crisis and the academic job market. So that's another kind of emergent quality of this kind of work.
So I'm going to move through these next couple slides pretty quickly because we want to leave a good amount of time for questions and answers. But this one here, the reason I put this one up there, what is the place for a student in a discussion about learning the digital landscape? This is from an article called A Letter from a Hybrid Student. And it was a student responding to the work of the journal and responding to the hashtag chats that we had been running, basically saying, you talk a lot about wanting students inside of this space, wanting students thinking about pedagogy with you. And this student wrote this article that basically said, I don't even know how to enter that space. And it's been something we've really struggled with. We want students to really be creating pedagogy with us, and yet they don't know how to get access to that conversation. And there's a way in which we're so trained to have those conversations in separate rooms from students that we don't always know how to invite them into the conversation. So one thing that we're doing is we're planning a CFP that's really geared towards students. Undergraduate students, graduate students, and I'm even flirting with the idea of how can we bring K through 12 students into this conversation about what is the future of education? Where is my voice inside the future of education? This is the Beyond Rigor article that was mentioned earlier. Just show that briefly. The last one, play constitutes a new form of critical inquiry. This is an article by Adel and Co. that was published really recently. And the reason I want to show this is because I think it's important that we don't just talk about the rigor of our process, that we also talk about the playfulness of our process, and that playfulness can be a sort of rigor in its own right. This piece, I adore this piece, and its process is really unique. She was writing a keynote. She was preparing a keynote that she was going to give, and she said, once I'm done with this keynote, can we publish it on hybrid pedagogy? Can we review it and publish it on hybrid pedagogy? And I said to her, why don't we see if we can peer review it collaboratively while you're writing it and publish it before you give it? And it ended up being what I call, and we've only been able to do this a few times, and it's really been dependent upon having the right editors and the right author who can collaborate and collaborate quickly. I called this Flash Reviewed, because we did the entire process. She wrote it, it was reviewed, it was published, all in about 24 hours. Now, we were working pretty nonstop during those 24 hours, but I will guarantee we did as much work and as much intentional work on the review and editing of this piece in 24 hours as we do for most of our pieces spread out over 3 months. 24 hours of solid work, 4 people working on the piece, one the author, 2 peer reviewers, and a production editor that was helping run it. We don't publish all of our pieces that way, but we have published, I think we've published 3 pieces that way now. And it's a sort of to say that this doesn't need to take 6 months. Sometimes we actually want to publish things in process before they're finished. So I'm actually just going to skip these next couple. And this is just actually going right back to what Aria said at the beginning. I believe generosity is what will drive the future of digital publishing. Gatekeeping, I'm going to work throughout, as this journal continues to evolve, to kind of shut down gatekeeping as the sort of standard model of what you do with a journal, and figure out ways that we can instead think of generosity as the model for academic publishing. And I kind of want to turn this on you now. What is the future of academic writing? Thank you.
Thanks for coming.